London, December 3, 1872. A man stands before the Society of Biblical Archaeology and tells them that the book of Genesis is not unique, that somewhere in the ruins of a city buried under the desert of northern Iraq, someone had written the story of a flood, a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. A man warned in advance, an ark built to specifications, birds sent out to find land, the survival of one family and the seed of all living things, written on clay. Some 4 centuries before the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, were copied. The room went quiet. Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, who held office from 1868 to 1974 and who was present in the audience that evening, sat in silence. Newspapers reported the announcement the following day, and a world that had understood its own religious narratives as unique, as revealed, as singular, discovered that they were part of something much older, much wider, much stranger. Today, you examine that discovery, what it meant, how it happened, and why a Victorian Englishman's astonishment in 1872 tells something fundamental about the way all cultures manage their relationship with death. George Smith was not supposed to find this. He was born in 1840 in Chelsea, London, the son of a working-class family. At 14, he was apprenticed to Messrs. Bradbury and Evans of Bouverie Street, where he was to learn banknote engraving, the craft of cutting extraordinarily precise, fine lines into metal plates that become printed currency. It was skilled work, the kind that required exceptional patience, a fine eye for detail, and the ability to see and reproduce microscopic patterns with consistency. These were exactly the skills needed to decipher cuneiform, the ancient wedge-shaped writing system of Mesopotamia, in which each character is composed of tiny pressed marks whose differences of angle and depth carry all the meaning. Smith had become fascinated by the Assyrian antiquities arriving at the British Museum from excavations in Mesopotamia. He spent his lunch hours and his evenings at the museum, studying the tablets, teaching himself cuneiform from published grammars and from his own close observation of the marks. He had no university degree, he had no formal training in ancient languages. He had extraordinary native ability, exceptional pattern recognition, and the kind of patience that comes from years of engraving. The tablets he was studying had arrived at the British Museum beginning around 1850, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, located near the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. The first great find of library tablets was made by the English traveler and excavator Austin Henry Layard in 1850. His Iraqi assistant Hormuzd Rassam carried the work on, and in 1852 uncovered a second palace holding another large collection of tablets, and it was Rassam's excavation, not Layard's, that produced the flood tablet itself. There were tens of thousands of fragments, many broken, many not yet deciphered. They came from the great library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 669 to about 631 BCE, more than 6.5 centuries before the birth of Christ. Ashurbanipal was one of the most remarkable rulers of the ancient world. His library, discovered beneath the ruins of the palaces at Nineveh, was the first systematically collected and catalogued library in the world. The king's explicit ambition was to collect everything, every cuneiform text in existence from every library in Mesopotamia. He sent agents throughout the empire with orders to copy or confiscate any tablet that was not already in Nineveh. He gathered many times more than has come down to us. Around 30,000 tablets and fragments from Nineveh survive in the British Museum today. How the collection stood on its shelves we do not know, because the tablets were not found in place. It was, in effect, an ancient Dewey Decimal System pressed into clay, the first systematic attempt to gather and catalog all knowledge in one place. When Nineveh fell to the combined forces of the Medes and the Babylonians in 612 BCE, that is 612 years before the birth of Christ, the palace was burned. The fire, paradoxically, was the tablet's salvation. It baked the clay harder, preserving it better than it would have been had the palace simply been abandoned.
But the library did not simply fall where it stood and wait to be found. The British Museum's own survey of the entire collection, completed in 2024, established that the library had been sifted through and then deliberately smashed, the broken pieces dumped around the palaces at Nineveh. What lay in that ground was not a library waiting to be reopened. It was a library that someone had taken apart. It lay there in the dark for nearly 25 centuries, from 612 BCE to its excavation from 1850 onward, a span of approximately 2,460 years. And when George Smith read those tablets in 1872, he was reading words that no one had been able to understand since the night Nineveh burned.
This is already a story of the failure of cultural immortality. Ashurbanipal had assembled the greatest library in the world specifically to preserve the knowledge of his civilization, and within 20 years of his death, his empire had been collapsed and his library had been broken up and buried. The systematic attempt to preserve everything, to guarantee the survival of the great tradition, was defeated by the same historical contingency that defeats every human enterprise.
Smith's reading of Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh produced a sensation that is difficult to convey today because we live in a world where it is taken for granted that ancient civilizations preceded and influenced the cultures that produced the Bible. But in 1872, the theological stakes were very different. The dominant view in educated Victorian England and in the United States was that the Bible was historically reliable, at least in its major outlines. The flood was understood as a real event, divinely sent, divinely survived, divinely recorded. The idea that it was a story, a narrative that had pre-existed the Bible, that the biblical authors might have encountered, adapted, theologized, was not a comfortable one. Smith's reading of the flood narrative in Tablet 11 placed the Victorian theological world in an extremely uncomfortable position. The similarities between the Gilgamesh flood and the Genesis flood were simply too close to be coincidental. The structure was identical: divine decision to send a flood, one man warned by a sympathetic deity, an ark built to specific dimensions, the flooding of the world, the survival of family and animals, the sending of birds to find land, the sacrifice offered when the waters recede, the divine blessing of the survivor. The theological responses ranged from denial to accommodation to radical revision. Some argued that the similarities proved the reliability of the Genesis narrative. If multiple ancient cultures remembered the flood, that confirmed it really happened. Others argued that the Babylonian text was a distorted version of the true biblical original. Still others, the modernists, the higher critics, argued that this was evidence that the biblical texts were culturally conditioned documents shaped by the literary and narrative traditions of the ancient Near East. In the United States, the discovery hit particularly hard. The theological battles that followed Smith's discovery were fought in American seminaries and universities with a ferocity that, in retrospect, looks like the first skirmish in the culture wars that would dominate American intellectual life for the next century and a half. Smith himself died in 1876 at the age of 36. He had gone back to Nineveh, back to the source, for a third season of excavation, looking for more tablets, more fragments, more pieces of the puzzle. He fell ill on the journey home and died at Aleppo in Syria on the 19th of August. The results of that final season were never published. A man who gave the world back one of its greatest stories and then vanished almost as completely as Gilgamesh himself.
The Epic of Gilgamesh is the ancient world's great narrative of the pursuit of immortality. Its central subject is the human refusal to accept death. Its argument, the walls, the work, the text as monument, is precisely about the capacity of human creation to outlast the individual who created it. And yet this text was itself almost lost, was itself buried, was itself forgotten for nearly 2.5 millennia. The scholar David Damrosch, then professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University and today at Harvard, published a book in 2007 called The Buried Book: The Loss and Rediscovery of the Great Epic of Gilgamesh. And in it, he highlighted something of lasting significance. The first literary narrative of cultural immortality nearly failed to survive. Damrosch uses this paradox to open a reflection on what he calls world literature, texts that cross cultural and temporal boundaries to speak to readers in contexts entirely remote from their origin. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, in his reading, the paradigmatic example.
a text from Mesopotamia, written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of ancient Babylon, dealing with the specific cultural and religious universe of the ancient Near East, and yet speaking, across 3,000 years and every imaginable cultural difference, to the most universal of human preoccupations.
Jan Assmann, the German Egyptologist and cultural theorist at the University of Heidelberg, gives the theoretical framework for understanding how this works. In his 1992 study, Das kulturelle Gedächtnis, translated into English as Cultural Memory and Early Civilization, Assmann distinguishes between communicative memory, which is the living memory of the last 3 or 4 generations transmitted through direct contact, and cultural memory, which is the memory of a community's origins and defining events, transmitted through canonical texts, rituals, monuments, and educational institutions. Cultural memory is what allows a text to survive across centuries, but only if the institutional structures that transmit it remain intact. When those structures collapse, even the greatest works can vanish.
Ashurbanipal assembled his library. Nineveh fell. The library was broken up and buried. The cultural memory it contained was interrupted for nearly 25 centuries, from 612 BCE to 1872 CE. The transition from cultural memory to oblivion is not slow, it is catastrophic. Texts do not fade gradually from awareness. They fall off a cliff when the institution that copies and teaches and discusses them ceases to exist. The Sumerian language had already been a dead language for 1,000 years when Nineveh fell, known only to scholars, preserved only in the scribal schools. When those schools disappeared, the memory disappeared with them. What brought the memory back was not continuity, but rupture. The rupture of the earth itself, excavated by 19th century archaeologists who did not know what they would find. Layard dug not because he was looking for the Epic of Gilgamesh. He did not know it existed. He dug because the mounds of Mesopotamia were known to contain antiquities, and antiquities were valuable to the museums of Imperial Europe. The recovery of the text was accidental. The most important literary recovery in the history of scholarship happened because a British aristocrat wanted to find impressive things to send to the British Museum.
The question this raises for contemporary America, for any culture that is building what it believes will be lasting monuments, is disquieting. Google's stated mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine preserves snapshots of the entire web. Facebook stores billions of photographs, millions of videos, decades of personal history. These are the digital equivalents of Ashurbanipal's library. They are extraordinarily impressive. They are also, and the Epic of Gilgamesh teaches this with great precision, not immortal. They are contingent. They depend on institutional continuity, on energy supply, on political stability, on the continued existence of the organizations that maintain them. Ashurbanipal's library was, by the standards of its time, equally impressive, and it was buried by a war. George Smith's discovery in 1872 was not only a philological event, it was a cultural event. It forced a confrontation with the possibility that the questions we consider most distinctively our own, about death, about survival, about what endures, have already been asked and answered and forgotten and rediscovered and forgotten again across a human history much longer and stranger than we usually allow ourselves to think.
And it raised implicitly a question that this series is asking explicitly. If the oldest story humanity wrote down is a story about the pursuit of immortality, and if that story itself was almost lost, then what does that say about our own pursuit, about our skyscrapers and our digital archives, and our anti-aging biotechnology, and our plans to extend the human lifespan indefinitely? Perhaps it says, do not be too confident that the walls will stand. History has a way of burying things. But it also says something else, something more hopeful. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh was buried, and it came back. The tablets survived, the text survived. And the reason it survived is precisely that it said something true about the human condition that every generation that encountered it recognized as its own. Truth is the only form of immortality that does not depend on institutional continuity. A true thing has a tendency to resurface. The walls endure, even when the city falls.
Some stories were never true. Some truths were never seen right.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And let me know in the comments what you think. It helps me figure out what to cover next.